Okay, let's unpack this again. Picture your street for a moment. Is there ever that one house that makes you just, well, notice it?
Uh-huh.
Maybe the yard's got more character than a botanical garden gone wild, or the paint's doing its own abstract art thing by peeling off.
Yeah, I know the look.
You're definitely not alone if a property like that has ever caught your eye for, let's say, the wrong reasons.
Absolutely. And that very common experience, wondering what to do about a neighbor's property that feels like, well, an eyesore is what we're diving deep into today.
Hmm.
You sent over some really interesting material that highlights just how widespread and frankly tricky this whole issue can be.
Exactly. We've got two key pieces you shared. First up, there's a sort of advisory guide focusing on navigating those messy neighbor situations. Lots of practical tips in there.
Right.
Then we have a news article that really drills down into how often these eyesore properties pop up and the real-world challenges, the difficulties of actually getting them addressed.
So we're looking at this from two angles, really. The individual, neighbor to neighbor level,
Yeah.
and then the broader community and even the legal side of things.
Okay.
Our mission today is basically to equip listeners with a much clearer picture of the options they might have, and maybe even more importantly, the potential bumps in the road.
Good point.
We want to move beyond just that initial frustration, offer some actionable insights, and also get a better handle on those sometimes sensitive neighbor dynamics and, well, property rights.
And what really grabbed me right away from that news article, what if there's an eyesore next door? It's just how incredibly common this is.
Oh, yeah.
They mentioned a ServiceMagic.com survey. Get this, where 63% of people reported having or having had neighbors with poorly maintained exteriors.
Yeah, 63%.
That's almost 2 out of every 3 people. It's huge.
That figure really does suggest that maybe our expectations of, neighborhood uniformity are pretty high.
Or maybe.
Or that individual circumstances just make consistent upkeep a real challenge for a lot of folks.
Yeah, that too.
It makes you wonder if there's a bit of a disconnect between those ideal suburban landscapes and the messy realities of home ownership sometimes.
Definitely.
What's interesting is how the article details what counts. It ranges from relatively minor stuff like overgrown weeds to bigger problems like structural damage or just tons of clutter.
Right.
It really shows why this resonates with so many people. It's not just one thing.
It does. But then, almost immediately, our Messy Neighbors Guide throws in a really important point about perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yes. Subjectivity.
Exactly. It highlights that there's a very subjective element to what we even consider an eyesore. What might really bug you could be something someone else barely notices.
Or even sees as, I don't know, character.
Maybe, yeah. Or just not ideal, perhaps, but not really a problem in their eyes.
That's such a crucial distinction. And the messy neighbors piece, it smartly reminds us there can be a whole range of reasons behind a property's condition.
Like what?
Well, it could stem from something like a genuine struggle with hoarding, which is, a complex mental health issue,
Yeah.
or simply a lack of physical ability to keep up with maintenance, or maybe just different personal standards. What stands out to you about that subjectivity piece?
It definitely makes you pause, doesn't it, before getting too worked up? Because what feels like obvious neglect to you, well, it might not even register for your neighbor. Their threshold for what's acceptable could just be different.
Totally. Or they just don't see it the same way.
It's a good reminder that our own personal preferences really color how we see these things.
Exactly. And this understanding kind of leads us naturally to the advice in Messy Neighbors about those initial considerations before you jump into action.
Right.
The guide really emphasizes trying to be understanding and respectful of your neighbor's situation. That seems like a really vital first step, wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. And I thought it was particularly thoughtful when it suggested considering your neighbor's age or physical limitations.
Yeah, that's important.
Are they maybe elderly? Do they have mobility issues? Because in those cases, what we might see as neglect could actually be someone needing help, but being, I don't know, too proud or embarrassed to ask.
That raises a good question. Thinking about that possibility, what are some initial, maybe low-pressure steps you could consider? The guide actually offers some pretty practical suggestions.
Right. It suggests maybe exploring if you could offer help directly, perhaps organizing a neighborhood cleanup day that kind of subtly includes their property.
Sneaky, but potentially effective.
Or even just casually offering to lend them your lawnmower or something.
Mm-hmm.
Or if that feels a bit too direct, it brings up the idea of quietly offering to connect them with professionals who could help with yard work or painting.
Yeah, that might be easier for them to accept.
They might be more receptive if it takes the burden and potential awkwardness off them.
And the guide also touches on a really considerate point about safety and privacy, especially with older neighbors. While they might be hesitant to have strangers on their property, so suggesting a reputable, known service could address those concerns while still offering a solution.
Ah, good point.
It's really about trying to find a way forward that respects their dignity and whatever their underlying needs might be.
Okay, now shifting gears a bit. If you happen to live in a community governed by a homeowners association, an HOA,
Right, the HOA factor.
both of our sources highlight that as a potential avenue for dealing with these kinds of issues. The real estate attorney in the eyesore article specifically mentions HOAs often have authority for maintenance, parking, even noise complaints.
And what's interesting is how that eyesore article used the example of Lakewood Ranch to show how this HOA process can actually work. Can you walk us through what that typically looks like?
Sure, so in Lakewood Ranch, if there's a violation of the community's deed restrictions, which cover things like overgrown landscaping, peeling paint, visible clutter, all that stuff.
The usual suspects.
Exactly. It typically falls under the HOA's responsibility. The process they follow is generally pretty structured. First, they'll send the owner a formal letter detailing the violation and asking them to fix it within a certain time.
Okay, step one, the letter.
If there's no response or improvement, they usually follow up with a second letter to schedule a hearing. The homeowner can then discuss the issue there,
A chance to explain, maybe.
presumably.
Eh.
And ultimately, if the problem still isn't resolved, the HOA has the power to impose fines. And sometimes those fines can get pretty hefty.
So in those deed-restricted communities, the HOA basically acts as the enforcer for certain community standards on property appearance.
Pretty much.
But what about those of us who don't live in neighborhoods with HOAs? What alternatives do our sources point to then?
Well, in those cases, both the Messy Neighbors Guide and the eyesore article suggest reaching out to your local code enforcement office.
Okay, City Hall route.
Or if there's a clear health or safety risk involved, think things like, major pest infestations or structures that look like they might fall down.
Serious stuff.
Yeah, serious stuff. Then contacting the local health department is another option. That seems like the logical next step when you don't have that HOA framework.
That makes sense. These municipal bodies often have specific ordinances about basic property maintenance, especially where it could affect public health or safety.
Like grass height.
Exactly. Excessively high grass that could harbor pests or unsafe structures, that kind of thing would likely fall under their jurisdiction.
But then the eyesore article introduces a rather sobering reality check when it comes to taking legal action yourself, like actually suing a neighbor to try and force them to clean up.
Ah, the lawsuit option. Sounds messy.
According to the real estate attorney they interviewed, successfully doing that is incredibly challenging, really hard.
What's the core reason for that difficulty from the legal standpoint in the article?
Well, the attorney emphasizes this deep-rooted legal principle that how someone chooses to use and maintain their private property is, and I quote, pretty much sacrosanct.
Sacrosanct. Strong word.
Yeah. Basically, homeowners have a lot of freedom. To successfully sue, you'd have to prove their property's condition is a genuine legal nuisance or a hazard from an objective viewpoint.
Not just ugly.
Right. And as he put it, one man's junk is another man's treasure, which highlights how hard it is to prove objective harm based just on looks.
So legally, a nuisance isn't just something unsightly. It generally has to substantially interfere with your use and enjoyment of your property.
Like what, specifically?
Think persistent, foul odors drifting over, or maybe vermin infestations spreading from their land to yours. Something tangible.
Gotcha. It really underscores the limits of the legal system for resolving these aesthetic disagreements between neighbors.
Definitely. You might find something personally offensive, but legally proving it rises to the level of demonstrable harm or danger. That's a very different and often difficult bar to clear.
And of course, for many homeowners dealing with a nearby property they think is an eyesore, a big worry is the potential hit to their own property value.
Yeah, the resale value concern.
And the overall appeal of their home if they want to sell eventually. The National Association of Realtors spokesman in the news article definitely validates this, says it's a legitimate concern.
He states quite clearly that an adjacent unkempt property can certainly affect a nearby property's desirability and saleability. According to the article, what kind of factors usually influence how big that impact might be?
Well, it seems to really hinge on how bad the disrepair is, and also whether there are other similarly neglected properties nearby.
Ah, so context matters.
Yeah. A single isolated case might have less impact than if, say, a whole street looks run down. The article even shared a local example
Oh, yeah?
about a very attractive home in Palmer that struggled on the market, specifically because it was right next door to an abandoned, poorly maintained property.
Oh, wow. That really drives the point home, doesn't it? The potential
Oh,
financial hit.
it certainly does. Paints a clear picture of how even a well-kept home can be dragged down by its immediate surroundings.
Okay. Now, the article also touches on trying direct negotiation with the neighbor. What specific advice does it offer for navigating that potentially tricky conversation?
Walter Maloney, the NAR spokesman, suggests taking a cordial, non-confrontational approach. He even gives a specific opening line you could try. My agent recommends that I speak with you.
Hmm. Framing it around selling your house?
Yeah, the idea is to frame it gently, maybe mentioning you're thinking of selling, and just be friendly, casual, and candid about your concerns. See if you can find some common ground.
That sounds like a reasonable first step for some people, maybe. But the Service Magic survey we mentioned earlier, the one in the article, it also gives some context on how often direct contact actually works. What did those results show?
Yeah, unfortunately, the data isn't exactly encouraging on that front. A big majority, 3 out of 4 respondents, said they never even tried talking to their neighbor about it.
Wow, that many just avoid it.
Seems so. And among those who did bring it up, 18% said it resulted in zero improvement. Nothing changed. And another 4% actually said it made things worse, created more tension in the relationship. Only a tiny fraction, around 4%, reported a completely satisfactory outcome.
So the odds aren't great.
Not really. While direct communication might seem like the most straightforward way, the data suggests it often doesn't fix the problem and can even backfire, making things more awkward.
Yeah,
It's that classic neighbor dilemma, isn't it? You want to say something, but you dread the potential awkwardness or conflict.
it really highlights that inherent awkwardness, yeah. And the potential for conflict when neighbors try to tackle these things directly, which is why exploring those more formal routes, like municipal ordinances, becomes a pretty significant consideration.
Yeah.
What did our sources tell us about that option?
Both sources mention contacting your local city or county to ask about any existing ordinances regulating property appearance, especially relating to health and safety.
Like the tall grass thing again.
Exactly. Excessively long grass, as we touched on, often violates local rules about weed control. The eyesore article specifically mentions that in many places, grass over a certain height, like maybe 8 inches, is often considered a violation.
Okay, so there might be specific rules on the books.
Right. But the article also points out a potential challenge here, actually figuring out which specific governing body you need to talk to.
Ah, the bureaucracy maze.
Yeah, could you elaborate on that potential complexity? It uses the Lakewood Ranch example again, where residents might need to figure out if it's the community development districts, the main HOA, an interdistrict authority, a stewardship district, the town hall, or even the wider Manatee County government.
Wow, that sounds confusing.
It can definitely feel like a maze. However, the advice in the article is pretty straightforward and practical. Call town hall first.
Just start there.
Yeah, as a starting point to get pointed in the right direction, basically.
That's certainly valuable, actionable advice. It underscores that there isn't always one single, obvious entity responsible, and starting centrally is often the most efficient path.
And circling back to our Messy Neighbors Guide, it reminds us that even with all these potential outside options, there's real value in focusing on what you can control,
Which is,
maintaining your own property, and trying to cultivate positive relationships with your neighbors in general.
why is that emphasis on your own actions and just, being a good neighbor so important here?
Well, as the guide wisely puts it, a little kindness can go a long way. Even if you can't directly change their property, taking pride in your own home feels good for you and helps the overall look of the street.
True.
And having good relationships already established might make any future, maybe difficult conversations just a little less strained.
Yeah.
You got some goodwill built up.
It's about focusing on your sphere of influence, right?
Yeah.
And building that foundation of positive interaction that might make tackling sensitive stuff a bit easier later. Now, finally, the eyesore article briefly touches on what it kind of dramatically calls the firing off a gun approach.
Right, the lawsuit for injunctive relief.
Yeah. Even if a clear legal win seems unlikely, what's the thinking behind considering such a drastic step as a last resort?
Well, the attorney suggests that even if you don't ultimately win in court and legally force your neighbor to clean up.
Which sounds unlikely anyway.
Right. The very act of filing a lawsuit might be enough to really get their attention and maybe, just maybe, push them to take some action.
A sort of legal shot across the bow.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
It's definitely presented as a pretty extreme measure, though. Certainly not step 1 or 2 or even 3.
So it really underscores the level of frustration some homeowners can reach when they feel their property value or quality of life is being hit.
Yeah.
But it also highlights the potential for serious escalation and, again, the low chance of a favorable legal outcome in most of these disputes.
So as we bring this deep dive towards a close, what would you say are the main takeaways for someone dealing with a neighbor's property they find less than ideal?
Okay. Key takeaways. I think the first crucial point is recognizing that inherent subjectivity. What is an eyesore? It's not always agreed upon.
Good point. Step 1, check yourself.
Right. Then approach the idea of direct communication cautiously. Understand that while it seems direct, the data suggests it often doesn't work and can even create more tension.
Okay, manage expectations there.
After considering that, explore the more formal channels, HOA if you have one, or municipal options like code enforcement or the health department, especially if there are real health or safety concerns.
Use the system if it applies.
And finally, just acknowledging the very real limits and challenges of trying to use legal action in these kinds of situations. It's usually not the magic bullet.
Yeah, that comes through loud and clear.
Yeah.
And it really brings home that navigating these neighbor situations is just, it's a delicate balancing act, isn't it?
It really is.
You're constantly trying to weigh your desire for a nice-looking community against respecting individual circumstances and, fundamental property rights.
Precisely. Which leads us maybe to this final thought for our listeners. Considering all these different avenues we've explored today,
Yeah.
what does this tell us about that broader tension between individual freedom, how we manage our own private spaces, and the collective desire for a certain level of community aesthetic and well-being?
That's a big question.
And maybe how do you personally define what it means to be a good neighbor in situations like these?
Yeah.
And what role does communication, or maybe the lack of it, ultimately play in finding solutions that work?
Definitely something to mull over as you navigate your own neighborhood dynamics. Good place to leave it.